everyone, and welcome to the second episode of our new historical podcast, Ranked, looking at the presidents. Today, we're looking at the presidencies of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So we're covering the second and third chief executives, respectively. So the first presidency we're going to look at, as I mentioned prior to that, is the presidency of John Adams. He was the first vice president of the United States under the Washington administration. And prior to the Constitution and the establishment of executive government, he was first minister to the United Kingdom and to the Netherlands. And he had extensive foreign policy experience prior to that as an envoy to France as well. So certainly someone who played a pivotal role as a founding father in the preeminence of the brand new American purpose leading up to the Revolution and after the Revolution, both domestically and on the foreign policy front. And he passed that on to his son, John Quincy Adams, who's now regarded as one of the best secretaries of state in history. So definitely a diplomatic family, someone very, very smart indeed. He was born in Braintree, Massachusetts Bay, now called Quincy, and that was on October 30th, 1735. And he died on July 4th, 1826, in his hometown at the age of 90. Interestingly, within hours of Thomas Jefferson, someone that he ended up reconciling with and forming a great friendship, especially written friendship between the two after their tenuous relationship at the beginning of the century. And he lived quite a long time, to the age of 90. Early on, he was part of the pro-administration faction, eventually joined the Federalist Party. He's the only Federalist president in history. And after the demise of the Federalist Party, later in life, he identified with the Democratic Republicans. Abigail Adams, born Abigail Smith, obviously one of the most important first ladies we've ever had. Certainly the Adams duo, as you'll hear throughout this episode, was quite fascinating. He had 6 children, graduated from Harvard University, and despite being remembered for a controversial presidency, he's generally remembered as one of the most important founding fathers, and personality aside, one of the most intelligent thinkers we've ever had. Certainly, in many respects, the counterpart and the equal to Jefferson on many early political debates of the era. So with that, we'll get into his presidency. So he was elected in the presidential election of 1796. Again, the only election the Federalist Party has won. And we went over how elections work before the 12th Amendment last time around. So his presidency began on March 4th, 1797, and it lasted until March 4th, 1801, because the Federalists ended up losing the election of 1800 and the electoral runoff between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, both Democratic Republicans, chose his successor. When Adams entered the office, he entered, one might say, into a situation of turmoil, especially looking at the foreign policy issues of the day, particularly the few that we discussed last time dealing with France and Great Britain. Now, as you know, Washington had pressed for neutrality in that conflict. It was one of the great mainstays of his presidency and the presidential thought with which he governed. But it was causing difficulties for trade, as we mentioned. The blockade of France by the British Navy had negatively impacted trade to the United States, which resulted in some pushing for an embargo on England altogether. The attempts to negotiate with France in this conflict led to the Xyz Affair, which is very, very well known. We'll get into that later. And it resulted in the souring of relations between France and the United States and the beginning of the Quasi-War. But before we get into his administration, let's just take a look at his cabinet, as we did for Washington. So his vice president was Thomas Jefferson, because he finished second in the election. His Secretary of State, his first Secretary of State was Timothy Pickering. His second was John Marshall, who, interestingly enough, would go on to become the 4th Chief Justice of the United States. His Secretary of the Treasury for most of his administration was Oliver Wolcott. His Secretary of War was James McHenry and then Samuel Dexter. His Attorney General was Charles Lee, and his Secretary of the Navy, a new position, was Benjamin Stoddard. So you can see the cabinet that had been established under Washington at this point had begun to grow, and it acquired the term of cabinet at this point, the Adams cabinet. So, Eric, do you have any first thoughts on Adams?
Yeah, I think we'll go. I'll just explain a little bit about the election first, which is really fascinating because it's one of the dirtiest elections in American history in terms of the rhetoric that was thrown around. As per usual, neither side actively campaigned for the presidency in the 1970 or 1796 election. But that doesn't mean that both camps were not very, very vicious towards each other. You had that France-Britain split, the divide over this agrarian status and the more industrial vision of Alexander Hamilton. And then finally, you had the North South divide, with Adams being a Massachusetts guy from the Northeast, one of the more affluent areas, and Jefferson being from Virginia, being from the South. If you look at how the election went, it really does show a divided country, a very deeply divided country. You'll notice right here, all the states have been admitted by this point that had the original 13 colonies. There were 16 states at this point. You had Kentucky and Tennessee that had become states. But you'll notice very clearly the North-South divide. While Adams did win 3 electoral votes in southern states, or 2 electoral votes in southern states and then 1 in Pennsylvania, you'll notice his support was basically contiguous, from Massachusetts or from Maryland to Delaware, New Jersey, all the way up along the coast. Same with Jefferson, was the southern half of the country. So that sort of divide really characterized this administration. And while his administration proved to be on the losing side of the battle over the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, I think these formative years did really set up in the long term, the Hamiltonian vision that the Federalist Party embraced turned out long term. You'll notice a lot of those policies in terms of industrialization really became really evident during the Adams administration. That Hamiltonian influence really did settle and become solid, and ultimately long term did drive the direction of our country. Not this agrarian democracy that Jefferson envisioned, but the sprawling industrial country that Hamilton fought for and advocated for.
And Sarah, do you have any thoughts?
I think it was a case of a difficult act to follow. Obviously, you'd had 2 terms of George Washington, the almost universally revered hero of the Revolution. And that, it is a tough act to follow, especially when he won unanimously. Mm-hmm. No, he had his slanders, etc., but it was never that impactful. As Eric said about the 1796 election, one of the most vicious. If we think that ones of today are bad, then it's just 10 times as bad.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to overstate how bad it was. It was vile stuff being thrown around.
Again, another great Lindsey Graham one, American Elections, Wicked History, goes into that one. And it's, people were mean. So I think that was Adams probably going into the presidency was following George Washington. And whether he tried to sort of be George Washington too, I would argue against that. They were very different people. Again, George Washington from Virginia under slaveholder, John Adams, Massachusetts, and the opposite. So anything he did, he would always try and distance himself from Washington. And I think we could definitely see that because George Washington, he developed everything. He was the first to do what he did for cabinet, presidency, and everything. John Adams will always be second place in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, looking at the Adams administration, generally today, despite his record as a diplomat, despite his record as a founding father, he's generally remembered as a relatively mediocre president, someone who was not as effective in accomplishing his agenda as his successor, Thomas Jefferson. Although, notably, I guess it's important to look at the Adams administration when you look at the court, because the famous Marbury versus Madison court case that decided judicial review by essentially declaring the Judiciary Act of 1789 to overstep the Supreme Court's powers as discussed in the Constitution was precipitated by Adams because he tried to nominate a bunch of midnight judges right before leaving office, and one of his appointments was Marbury. And Madison, as Secretary of State under the new Jefferson administration, was tasked with handing out commissions and did not give the commission required for Marbury to take up his judicial position, which then resulted in that as well. At this point, John Jay had been appointed. But if you look at the number of judges appointed by Adams, he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, and John Marshall, one of his appointees, who replaced Oliver Ellsworth, would go on to become the Chief Justice at the time. Now, Adams also initially nominated John Jay who was a former Chief Justice at that point, but he declined to return to his position, which was interesting. I think we should start by looking at the foreign relations, because that was what really dominated the Adams administration. I mean, even today, the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts dealt with the public's perception, essentially, of the relationship with France up to that time. So I guess I'll just throw it to you. Sarah, do you have any thoughts about the XYZ affair and how it completely disrupted relations between France and the United States, turning two former allies pretty much against each other?
Well, I think we discussed this last episode. We basically said that Great Britain and America's relationship didn't really matter during the Washington administration. Britain was cutting its losses, licking its wounds over it. And then to lose France was definitely more of a blow, because they always saw them as an ally. And I think everything was very complicated post-French Revolution. You had strange governments, and then eventually a Bourbon Revolution once again. I can't say I know too much about the XYZ affair. I'm going to call it Z because I'm British, and bringing myself to say Z would break my little heart.
Mm-hmm.
But I think losing France was definitely a big issue, purely because they had been the original ally. And that is probably something Adams would later, you would see Jefferson later cling on to. Because Jefferson still had loyalty to France. He'd been minister to France. He was still friends with the Marquis de Lafayette.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the XYZ affair, I'll mention just for the context here, was basically trying to interface with the French during the French-British War at the time. American agents had tried to discuss, talk with France, and in order to talk with the diplomat, they were basically requested to pay bribes. This was really outrageous. It was known that this particular diplomat they were dealing with was known to do this, but the American people in particular felt very betrayed by this. That they were being treated this way. And obviously, at the time, France is a great European power, still is a great European power. Americas are still, at this point, not a great European power or comparable to that. But not treating each other as equals really, I think, in the long run, got rid of the pro-French mentality that a lot of Americans had in terms of, they sided with us, we'll side with them. It turned more into realizing that it's not as much of the French love us as much as they dislike the British. And they may not be too keen on working with us as equals as we had thought. The whole quasi-war that it led to, the really dominated the end of the Adams administration. I think it hampered, kind of like with the Bush administration, where they were dominated by the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war on terror in general. The Adams administration became dominated by foreign policy, which in hindsight, I think, is let some academics, favor that side of his administration, which is deemed a little more successful, more than the domestic policies like the Alien and Sedition Act, which is generally regarded as a horrible bill today. The fact that Adams was a skilled diplomat himself and knowledgeable about this, I think, made him a very good person at the time, personally, from my perspective, to deal with something like this, as opposed to someone like Jefferson, who may have been a little bit more close to France or a little bit more forgiving.
Still, though, it's important to note that one of the big things with the quasi-war is Adams didn't see any purpose in joining the British alliance against the French. So, like Sarah said, the British really didn't care much about the relations with the Americas at this point. Yeah. And America wasn't really keen on allying with the British. And obviously, their relationship with the French had been permanently hampered, and regime change in France as a result of the revolution had really rocked the boat. I mean, you have to keep in mind that when Adams was envoy to France, that was well over a decade and a half before he became president. So that was a very different France during the Revolutionary War than it was post the first stage of the revolution.
Yeah.
Another thing that's interesting in terms of foreign relations that we didn't really touch on last time, in 1795, there was a treaty signed between the United States and Spain called the Treaty of San Lorenzo. And what this basically did is it set the border with the Spanish territory of Louisiana. And that's important because later in this episode, we will be talking about Louisiana Purchase, which occurred as one of the hallmarks of the Jefferson administration. So with that, I think we should look at some of the domestic issues that occurred under the Adams administration. Obviously, this is a trivia standpoint. He was the first president to actually live in the White House. He moved in before he was inaugurated because December 1800 was really set as a hard deadline for finishing governmental buildings. But by the time he was elected, the White House was already constructed, although bare bones constructed. But it wasn't exactly, it wasn't completely finished when he moved into it. The Alien and Sedition Acts, this is kind of a domestic policy issue associated with the foreign policy issue. Because the U.S. had become really polarized during the Quasi-War, and Adams, frankly, I'm sure a lot of people don't really know this, but he did have an ego, and he did not like being attacked by the press at all. So I think that could have fueled his decision behind the Alien and Sedition Acts, almost in a way letting his own egocentrism kind of overwhelm his better judgment with regards to the law and what would be understood as a valid way of, well, there really isn't a valid way of limiting public criticism of government. But essentially, the Alien and Sedition Acts were composed of 4 parts. So you had the famous one, the Naturalization Act, then the Alien Friends Act, the Alien Enemies Act, and the Sedition Act. And the whole point of these combined acts is that they were designed to prevent secessionists from being able to garner enough support to overthrow the government. So essentially, this was used to stretch out the bounds of constitutional law to effectively deny anybody the true ability to criticize the administration. So the Naturalization Act, it greatly increased the period of residence required for an immigrant to garner citizenship, and this was clearly a blow designed to stop someone from, let's say, moving from France and then garnering citizenship after just a few years rather than 14, and then inciting riots that would lead to hatred of the government and government policy toward France. And the Alien Friends and Enemies Acts allowed the government to deport any foreigner who was viewed as dangerous. And finally, the Sedition Act, which is really almost the Adams ego clause, included prison sentences and fines, almost half a decade in prison, simply for publishing anything that the administration would deem false, scandalous, or malicious in writing against the government or any of its officials, or criticism of any of its policies. And these acts went down the toilet, essentially, in the view of the American public, and they essentially sank the Adams administration with them. I mean, there was a congressman who was punished under the Alien and Sedition Act, and a number of newspaper editors, due to the last portion of the act, were obviously quite bewildered by it, not beguiled, because they were constantly at risk of governmental punishment simply for punishing either opinion pieces that might have questioned the Adams administration, or just in general, maybe stating something that was true that Adams and his administration could have still viewed as detrimental and therefore violating the last part of the act. So do you have any, I'll throw it to either of you if you have any extra comments on what you think about the Sedition Act. Woodrow Wilson would controversially do something similar during World War I.
Yeah, technically speaking, the Alien Enemies Act is still federal law. It's the only one of these laws that is still, that was not repealed or allowed to expire when the Jefferson administration took over. And it was used to justify another series of abuses during the 1940s and World War II in particular. So, in justification, I believe, for more recent acts by President Trump, it's basically just been a gigantic can of worms. Obviously, this is a big sour mark on the Adams administration. I think this is single-handedly one of the worst sets of laws passed in American history, especially coming right off of the Constitution. These are pretty clearly, if they're constitutional, they're borderline at best. As someone looking back today, it's hard to justify how someone who had been so clearly involved in the process of drafting the Constitution, working on the Bill of Rights, on the Declaration of Independence, working on a bunch of these other things that had expanded this concept of liberty, to then go back and put in speech restrictions, seemed really, really problematic. Also, kind of the weaponization of immigration. It was deemed that immigrants were likely to favor the Democratic Republicans. So it's a little bit of a problem there. I think it's without a doubt the biggest black spot on the Adams administration, and a regrettable thing given what an otherwise pretty quality public servant Adams was. Whether you like him or not, you can respect the capability and the integrity with he generally went into office with. This is an exception to that, unfortunately.
I think this is a good point to throw out to Sarah to talk a little bit about the Adams personality and how that might have influenced legislation. And also, I think we should talk about Abigail Adams, because I know Sarah's an expert on that. And Abigail Adams played a very, very big role as John's equal in advising him both politically and diplomatically, even though he did not always heed her advice. She certainly played an incredibly strong role, in many respects greater than other first ladies that would come after John Adams.
Well, I was going to talk about Adams' personality, so that was very good switch over. I know we obviously aren't rating it on personalities, it's on how they were as presidents, but it did impact quite a lot because, like you said, he was arrogant. Contrast this to Washington, who was pretty much more humble. And yeah, he didn't want to be attacked. I mean, no politician does, but you don't make laws about it unless you're a dictator. And I'm not going to call him a dictator because this was when Adams took over, it was the first democratic political takeover in history. So that's another really groundbreaking point in American and world history. So yeah, he was very arrogant. He was, if you compare him to, Hamilton and Lafayette and more colourful characters of that era, he wasn't a party guy. He liked to sit and read. He liked to be a bit critical. He loved his wife, but he wasn't a social butterfly. This is especially evident in the John Adams miniseries when he goes to France and he's hanging out with Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin's whoring and drinking, and Ben Franklin says to Adams, "You need to go and get a mistress." And Adams is like, "No, I'm married." He was very
Ben Franklin was a partier, to put it simply. He's crazy.
I love Ben Franklin. Anywho, Abigail Adams, I'm very excited to talk about because she's my second favourite First Lady, and I'm a huge fan of hers. Mainly known for the quote of, "Remember, all men could be tyrants if they could." Not wrong there, honey. But she was very revolutionary for the time. And the one that struck me the most was that she wrote a will. Now, to many modern watchers, people are thinking, what's the big deal? It's a will. But she didn't actually have any property because she was a woman. And if she had any property, she wouldn't really have much say about who it went to. But John Adams actually did follow up on it when she died, which does show that he did love her and respect her. But she was in favour of equal education for blacks and whites, women's rights, etc. And this is how she pushed John Adams. John basically wrote back and said, "I love you, but no." And she was another thing she was against was the Alien Sedition Act, another case of first ladies going against their husbands on policy, which you will definitely see in the FDR episode along with Eleanor Roosevelt. So she's definitely one of the most impactful in terms of policy. So when we think of first ladies, we'll think of maybe Dolly Madison and Jackie Kennedy and Frances Cleveland for the social aspect, but for intellectualism, Abigail Adams was extremely, extremely important. They had a very happy marriage. This was a love match. It wasn't a Washington, "I married you for companionship and money and we're friends." This was a huge love match. And I think that made it important because I don't think that Adams would have listened to her. But he was initially attracted to her because he saw her reading and he was fascinated that she was a blue stocking intellectual. And I think they counterbalanced it out very much better. It was Abigail Adams who helped smooth over the rift because she'd looked after Jefferson's daughter Polly when they were in France, and when Polly died, Abigail wrote to Jefferson to say, "I'm sorry she died," and that's what brought the two men back together. So that is another very important thing that Abigail Adams did.
And I mean, looking at the administration in general, I think that she really did play a significant role, and I feel like she's one of the first ladies that's, I wouldn't say forgotten about, but I feel like more people should read about her and her true influence.
One other thing I'd want to mention about her, just real quick, her and Adams, is the slavery factor. Is out of the first 12 presidents of the United States, John Adams is the only president that did not own slaves at one point in his life. Both he and Abigail opposed slavery. John Adams actually represented slaves who were trying to appeal on a few occasions. He stopped doing that during the Civil War. I guess that was a necessary evil at that point to try and keep the South in hold. But both of them were if not abolitionists, they opposed slavery and viewed it as a moral evil. and never partook in it, which is the big distinction. You compare that to the next president we're going to talk about, who had very similar views on slavery, but also had some very different, was very much a hypocrite on that issue and did partake in it to a great degree.
Yep, and we'll be moving on to Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, and incidentally also the second vice president of the United States. He beat Aaron Burr in what you might call a runoff House contingent election, fellow Federalist, in the 1800 race. Federal. I just need to start over. So in 1800, you had John Adams leading the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson arguably leading the Democratic Republicans. Now, before the 12th Amendment, electors could cast votes for two candidates, and there was no distinction made between the president and the vice president. So, even though the Federalists lost overall by a wide margin electorally to the Democratic Republicans, the
election was fairly narrow, actually. But
no, I'm talking about the electoral vote.
Yeah, but the states, if you look at the states, the actual difference between Jefferson and Adams was not that huge. I think it was like 73 to 65. But the popular vote was enormous. It was a 60 to 40 at that point. So
yeah, that electoral margin is not that close. So
yeah,
the real close was the tie, essentially, between Aaron Burr and his fellow Democratic Republican politician Thomas Jefferson, and ultimately, after 34 ballots in the House contingent election, the tie was broken, and Thomas Jefferson was chosen as president, upholding up to that point the precedent that the vice president would go on to become president. And his vice president was initially Aaron Burr, because he finished second in the end. That wasn't that strong of a relationship. And eventually in his second term, George Clinton went on to be his vice president. But Aaron Burr's an interesting figure that we don't really have that much time to talk about at this point. But Thomas Jefferson was slightly younger than John Adams, even though they both died on the same day within hours of each other after restoring their friendship. He was born in Virginia into a decently wealthy family, April 13th, 1743, and died in 1826 at the age of 83. And he had 6 children as well. I should note 6 children with his true wife, but that there could have been up to 6 with Sally Hemings, which we'll talk about later. And he went to the College of William and Mary and later founded the University of Virginia. In terms of political experience, he was the very first Secretary of State, and like Adams, had a lot of diplomatic experience, was quite partial to France, and was the second U.S. minister to France, and also someone who was quite influential in the shaping of policy pre- and post-revolution. He famously did write the Declaration of Independence, and despite condemning slavery, he was a slave owner. So certainly, again, I don't think Jefferson would rank nearly as high as a president if we were taking his personal life into account, because he had some dubious personal morals when you look at what he did. But his presidency began in 1801 and ended in 1809. He was the second president to have served 2 whole terms. And in terms of comparison to the Adams administration, there's a lot more that happened, you might say, a lot more effectiveness going on in his administration. So first we'll look at the cabinet. His vice president, as I said, Aaron Burr in his first term, George Clinton in his second term. His Secretary of State was James Madison, which really started to begin that precedent of the Secretary of State later becoming president. His Treasury Secretary was Albert Gallatin. His Secretary of War was Henry Dearborn. And his Secretary of the Navy was Robert Smith. The only position that he really had multiple people serving in for his 2 whole terms was Attorney General. And he had Levi Lincoln Sr. for his first term, and then Caesar Augustus Rodney for his second term. But broadly speaking, compared to the Washington and Adams cabinets, there was a lot less turnover in the Jefferson cabinet, if you look at it. So I guess we'll throw it to Sarah. Do you have any first thoughts on Thomas Jefferson?
You have no idea how many Hamilton lyrics are scorching through my head right now. There is the I'll Be Back, which is when he returns from France and meets Hamilton, the election of 1800, which talks about the Aaron Burr situation. So yeah, a lot of Hamilton lyrics going through my head. Fascinating gentleman. Fun fact, he brought tomatoes over to the USA people thought it was poison, so he probably ate it at a dinner party in front of them and laughed while they called for a doctor, which I think is a fantastic anecdote. He was extremely intelligent. And one thing I want to note about him was his religion. He was essentially a deist. He didn't necessarily believe in Christianity, but he did believe in God. He rewrote the Bible to take out the miracles, which I think, considering how religious America is, even today, like an atheist would never be president. And I think that is definitely an important part of his character, is his sort of religious differences with, you have some very religious presidents, and he was not one of them. As for the Aaron Burr situation, when you had the electoral process where the runner-up became vice president, this is again, that was always going to happen. Jefferson, did seem that he had quite a few quarrels, and Hamilton, Burr, Adams, even probably Washington at some point. But I suppose with cabinets, you never really know what you're going to get, and he was quite lucky that he had a lower turnover rate, which may show that he had a more secure presidency than Adams, who shot himself in the foot with the Alien Sedition Acts.
Mm-hmm. Eric, do you have any first thoughts?
Yeah, definitely an interesting person. I would consider him to be kind of the opposite of Adams in a lot of ways. Jefferson's a much more collegial person by a lot of means. Also a much more hypocritical person, not with a lot of moral failings, but also a far more effective and consequential president. And certainly one of the most important thinkers in American history in terms of what he wrote, what he contributed to in their process, the ideals that he stressed frequently throughout his tenure in public life were laudable, quite generally. The Declaration of Independence, everything in there is to this day kind of the backbone of what this country's views of liberty are based off of. And yet to have someone also have such personal failings kind of gives you a reason not to idolize historical figures. They're all very complicated. One other, and on a lot of levels, his religious views are weird, to put it lightly, at least by the standard of the time. Today, I think his type of deism would be far more common in terms of what we would see in this country. But just in a lot of ways, he's a very interesting person, one of the more interesting presidents, and certainly those moral failings do put a damper on him. But unlike with Jackson, I would say, the moral failings didn't necessarily bleed into policy so much. In terms of the major things that his administration did, had really nothing to do with those individual personal failings. And that's why he stayed relatively towards the top of the list of presidents, whereas people like Andrew Jackson and Woodrow Wilson have gradually declined in the presidency because their failings did indeed influence their policy in really, really terrible ways. You don't quite see that with the Louisiana Purchase or with some of the other actions that were taken by Jefferson's administration.
Mm-hmm. So if you look at the Jefferson administration, we already touched on Marbury versus Madison last time, so that's pretty important. But one thing we should look at for domestic affairs was the real predecessor to Jacksonian democracy, though it was still resoundingly different, and that was Jeffersonian democracy, which really laid the foundation for the Democratic Republican Party during his first two terms and later through the Madison and Monroe administrations. So many Federalists at the time, they wanted society to remain the same as it had been in the colonial era. But Jefferson was keen on changing this. And the Jeffersonian democracy that he pioneered was really a belief in smaller national government and more agrarianism, focusing more on the rural rather than the urban. And in general, this is what Jefferson believed in. He wanted less, not more, and he wanted the people to have more freedom when they looked at how they did things. Now, obviously, he's still a hypocrite for condemning slavery, but still supporting it, not even in a clandestine way since he owned slaves. But in general, he wanted less from the government. And really, this egalitarian philosophy that he was pushing was designed to extend voting rights eventually to all white men, which would be one of the pioneers of the 1820s, essentially, in the 1824 election. And it kind of fit the times better than the Federalist policy because, the indentured servitude of the past had been declining. Hierarchies were declining in general. And the tradition of how employment would be conducted, education would be conducted, those traditions were all changing. And, as a result of that, Jefferson really paved his own path on domestic policy. And I think that's important to look at before we actually take a look at some of the policies that he sought out during his administration.
One thing I actually want to mention real quick about his view of democracy is kind of how strange it is in hindsight. This actually predates the concept of a left and a right wing. In many ways, what you're talking about, smaller government, rural stuff, emphasis on the individual, those sound like very much things conservatives today and libertarians, people who derive their values from classical liberalism, would tend to appreciate. But at the time, his republicanism, his view of democracy, placed him squarely in what you would call the left or the French column, whereas the views of the Federalist were of a larger federal government that could do more things, have more power, but it was generally in favor of a more aristocratic or hierarchical society in a lot of ways. So they're tended to group more on the right. It's obviously a little bit of a challenge going back and looking at things, but I think you would struggle to say that the Democratic Party of today embraces the same ideas that Jefferson did more than the Republican Party would, I would say. I wouldn't say it's a party swap, but you've seen more of a sorting when the Democratic Republicans became dominant where people went off to.
Yeah, I agree. Both parties, if you want to call it that, although it's hard since the modern day Republican Party didn't exist yet, but in general, you've had shifting ideological factions. So one of the driving parts of the domestic policy of the Jefferson administration that you might almost call a form of foreign policy, given the fact that we were dealing with a frontier that hadn't really been settled yet, and dealing with acquiring land under the Louisiana Purchase, made it a foreign policy issue because you were looking at France. Now, the first thing we really need to talk about with this is the Louisiana Purchase. So, Sarah, do you have anything to say about the backstory behind the Louisiana Purchase and how it really stands as one of the Jefferson administration's hallmark accomplishments today?
I think when you add any land or territory to the, not just the contiguous United States, but, Hawaii and Alaska, I think that's an extremely important thing that can't be overlooked. Louisiana and the surrounding area is huge and it's important. And I've also, you've got to factor in that Louisiana, southern states, lean slavery. I know they had a bit more liberal laws due to Creole nature, but that would help Jefferson a lot, having another southern slave-owning state. And I think that's what a lot of people overlook. I'm sure that wasn't his intention when he initiated the Louisiana Purchase, not at all. But I think it definitely helped. And I think that, like you said, people remember Jefferson not for his moral failings bleeding into politics, but for positive attributes such as the Louisiana Purchase.
And the Louisiana Purchase was just so important because if you think about the price the United States paid for all this land, it's almost a ripoff to France. If you look about just the vast tracts of land that they were selling away from their empire, essentially right into the hands of the United States. Not just Louisiana, but extending all the way up west to essentially the Canadian border, almost a full half of the United States up to that point. It was a gigantic swath of land for Napoleon to effectively authorize the giving away of to the United States for such a, it wasn't, I don't remember the exact amount of money they paid for it, but I remember it's always noted by historians that it was certainly underselling France and that Napoleon and the French did not really want to have to worry about this massive territory here butting up on what at that point had become British Canada. So one of the big things that was fascinating was the Lewis and Clark expedition. And Jefferson really formulated the groundwork for this idea of exploring the West prior to the Louisiana Purchase itself. And after that happened, the two explorers really made their way out across the West. And you just have to think about how fascinating this would have been at a time where so much of that land was just completely uncharted and had never been trodden upon by really any Westerner in any sense of the word. Up to that point, the bulk of that Louisiana Purchase land, the Spanish territory, all the way out to the Pacific coast, was just home to the free Native American tribes. And you really had little competition to them from the United States. So obviously you didn't have full-on settlement starting because the frontier boundary was really at its bulk, at its farthest extent, the Mississippi River at that point, but you had the Comanches dominating Texas and New Mexico all the way up to Wyoming and down to Mexico. And up to that point, despite their warlike nature as a tribe, they really hadn't encountered anybody settling in their territory. They just figured that the first white people to visit that land were mere traders or explorers, and therefore didn't bother with them. But you also had those Western tribes. You had the Apache. This was still before the Oklahoma Territory was created as the Indian Territory, and you had essentially the expulsion of Indian tribes out of the South there. And then you had the Sioux, who were really second to the Comanche in might, dominating the Dakotas and the Upper Plains. But again, it would have been a truly untouched natural world where you would not have had any American set foot in a very long time. I mean, the Spanish prior to this had tried to drive their line of colonization up. And even though they claimed land in the Americas, the Spanish could actually not establish viable colonies in the southwestern United States because the Comanche kept driving back their lines and killing all of their colonization parties. So it really was a complete failure on behalf of the Spanish. So thanks in part to the Comanche, most of that territory was relatively untouched by any man and unseen by most Europeans, even early explorers up to that point. So that's how big acquiring that land and fostering this expedition really was.
Mm-hmm. And it's worth noting, that the Louisiana Purchase was at the time of a dubious constitutional authority. The Constitution does not say anywhere that the president has the ability to purchase land. But literally, Thomas Jefferson was given such a great offer. He was given an offer he literally could not refuse, even with the potential problems that would ultimately have been resolved in his favor. When you're given that much land at that price, it's really hard to say no. And in the hindsight, it's really been, the entire states of Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, all these major states going all the way up to Montana were included in this purchase. It's really, really astounding what this did for the country. And the future westward expansion of the United States, pulling ultimately from a population center all the way on the East Coast to where the center of population is now somewhere closer to the center of the country, is a really impressive feat. And it's not possible without that Louisiana Purchase.
Mm-hmm. And Sarah, do you have any other comments on this with expansion?
I think, we saw the late 18th and early 19th century globally as very much a time for exploration. You've got Livingston, the famous explorer, and you had many across the world establishing new colonies, meeting new people. And I think probably Jefferson is second mainly only to Theodore Roosevelt in terms of exploration. Obviously, we will discuss Theodore Roosevelt in a later episode and his love of exploration. So I think that is essential because USA was like this little tin pot power at this point. It didn't really have much compared to, the Great Britain and France. And this is where we would slowly see it start to thrive. So I think this was definitely a turning point in favour of America, which again reflects positively on Jefferson's presidency, purely because he commandeered it. You would maybe see it later with the purchase of Alaska, known as Seward's Folly, which was later seen as a good thing when they struck oil. I don't think people realised how much they were going to get out of it until the purchase had happened, and that is why Jefferson is so revered in historical rankings, because he gave the USA a leg up in the world.
Mm-hmm. And there were some other important things that happened under the Jefferson administration as well. The United States Military Academy at West Point was established because he felt that having a military academy would increase the quality of the military. And the 12th Amendment also was ratified. As you know, you need 2/3. Well, you could have the states call for a constitutional convention, but since that hasn't been used, you need a two-thirds vote majority in both chambers of Congress, and then 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment. And that happened. The 12th Amendment was ratified, which changed and set in stone the method for election of the president. And the admission of the state of Ohio happened while Jefferson was in office as well. And it was really up to that point the very first state in that Northwest Territory, which we hadn't heard much about since the Northwest Ordinance. Now, in foreign policy issues, he was also beginning to rock the boat a little bit if you look about it. In fact, one of the fascinating things was the Marine Corps up to that point, which was very early. It was a branch of the United States Navy that was essentially sent in by Jefferson in the Barbary War to destroy the pirates off of the North African Barbary coast who had been capturing and pillaging American merchant ships. And that served as a precedent for what would eventually go on to be its own standing branch separate of the Navy. And it was a very successful war in the end. And it essentially marked a turning point, I guess you could say, in the tide of military history up to that point in the United States. It was one of the, since we had really only had a quasi-war with France, it was one of the few wars we'd had, few conflicts internationally we'd had up to that point, where we were actively on the offense at that point. We talked about the Louisiana Purchase as well. Now, I guess this is important to look at. The personality of Aaron Burr, who was his vice president. The relationship was a bit shaky. So, Sarah, do you have anything to say about the Burr conspiracy dealing with 1804 and then ultimately Burr mortally wounding Hamilton in a duel?
Well, Aaron Burr, I think personally, is a really fascinating figure. He's been vilified by history, probably rightly, for killing Hamilton, even though the jury's out on whether he actually meant to kill him. Most of these duels, killing didn't happen. That was quite rare. Burr was actually pretty egalitarian for the time. He was very much in favour of women's rights, including education, and he pushed for women to vote in certain circumstances. He had educated his daughter Theodosia to a very high level for the time, and even had a picture of Mary Wollstonecraft, the very famous feminist who wrote on vindication of rights of women or something to that effect, above his mantelpiece. And as you said, he was vilified by history. He wanted to be president in 1800. Obviously, Hamilton swore against him, which caused the famous duel 4 years later. Burr was essentially accused of treason or something to that effect, causing a major trial. He eventually got off. Whether Jefferson really wanted him to be done for treason or even be put to death, again, jury's out, but it was a way of getting rid of him. And obviously, the famous duel happened in July 1804, in which Burr and Hamilton had exchanged words. They rode to New Jersey. Burr shot Hamilton, who later died. And Burr basically had to flee the area / the country for a while because everyone was like, dude, really? And basically, it sort of set the tone for vice presidents and presidents. They fall into three categories. You have the Washington, Adams, and pretty much every vice presidency where they kind of get along, but they're not friends. Then you have ones with a genuine friendship, and the only one I can think of is Carter Mondale. And then you have the presidents and vice presidents who hate one another. And that is Burr and Jefferson down to a T. Probably pushed the Electoral College to think maybe we shouldn't vote them in together. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very essential part of history. But can you imagine what life would be like if, even today, if I believe, was it Bernie Sanders who came second in the Democratic primary in 2020? And if so, he would be vice president. Can you imagine that? That would be really fun.
I mean, even if just going off its purest level, if we had gotten to a point where we kept that in place, party primaries are disregarded for this, and we get through this, second place would be a Donald Trump vice presidency under Joe Biden, or a Hillary Clinton vice presidency under Donald Trump. These would be inherently nonsensical ways of running government.
It would be so much fun. Let's be realistic.
It would be entertaining.
It would be so. I mean, you guys would be screwed, but I'd be watching from my stable constitutional monarchy, like, hi.
I mean, you see this in the United States and states with lieutenant governors still. In states where the lieutenant governors are of the opposite party, and there are quite a few of them right now. North Carolina, for example, the governor can't leave state for more than a certain amount of time. Otherwise, the lieutenant governor doesn't become governor permanently, but can pass things. You even saw that in Idaho, where the governor left the state. The lieutenant governor signed an order basically doing COVID restrictions that the governor,
when he got back immediately, the governor is running against Governor Brad Little. So
yeah,
back on topic to Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. There were some other important foreign policy things that took place during his administration. So Florida and Haiti were both important up to this point, even though Florida wouldn't really be secured until General Jackson decided to just say, screw it, and take it over and kick the Seminoles out forever, essentially. And Haiti, because the Haitian Revolution had occurred, and Jefferson wanted the U.S. to be neutral up to that point. Now, he said the geographical and commercial implications of Napoleon's plans outweighed the fears the United States had of a slave-led nation. But ultimately, the Haiti conflict essentially just brought about more conflict between France.
Mhm.
I wouldn't say conflict, but more diplomatic tension between France and the United States. And Jefferson's decision not to recognize Haiti could have played into the fact that many people, well, it was a well-known fact that he was a Francophile, but he argued that by avoiding the recognition of Haiti, he could be in the good graces of France and thereby would have a better chance of acquiring a lower price for the land that came with Louisiana Purchase. So it turned out to work well for him. Unfortunately for him, Florida, divided into East and West Florida, was still occupied by the Spanish. And he did not get it with Louisiana Purchase. Although there was some disputed territory on both sides between the Spanish and at that point the Americans, because the Louisiana territory had been sold as part of the purchase to the United States. But it was separating the two portions of the Spanish Empire, if you will, at that point, although it had begun to decline. When it came to Native Americans and domestic policy, President Jefferson, again, he was an Enlightenment thinker in general, but he still believed in an assimilation policy towards the Indians at that point, known as, he called it a civilization program. And it was designed to be peaceful, but it still involved assimilation, meaning that the regional cultures of the individual tribes would essentially be thrown out of the window. But they were still dealing with Indian raids on the western frontier up to that point. And at the beginning of the War of 1812, some of these tribes allied with the British and actually attacked the western frontier, which drew the ire of the United States. And when combined with impressment of American sailors on American ships by the British, really helped fuel, more sentiments that soured the relationship between Great Britain and the United States enough for there to be a War of 1812. But these raids were one of the major causes of the War of 1812 in general. And the last thing was the slave trade, because the Constitution essentially had a built-in clause that said the slave trade would not end until 1808. That was the final year of the Jefferson administration. And after that point, the trade of slaves continued domestically within the United States, but after 1808, there could be no more foreign trade of slaves into the United States. But in general, looking at his tenure with Europe, it's kind of rocky. And the trade embargo they ended up placing through the Embargo Act of 1807, it was essentially designed to kick both Britain and France out of the picture and force them to recognize that America was going to be a neutral state. And today, a lot of people have questionable thoughts of that embargo and think it actually ended up hurting the United States more than it helped the United States. But Jefferson really did it more as a way of preventing war rather than actually benefiting the American economy. So that was the end of Jefferson as a president. But I'd like to have Sarah maybe talk a little bit about the Sally Hemings issue and Jefferson's actual wife, because I mentioned that a bit at the beginning with his children, but I wanted to save it for the end. And again, we don't judge these presidents on their personal lives, only what happened under their administrations, but I think it's important still to note.
And so his first wife was Martha Randolph Wales, who I believe was a relative of some sort, as was very common back in the day. She died when she was, I believe, 33 after the birth of her final child. She was often very sickly, had a lot of pregnancies back then. Obviously, a lot of women died of complications because of lack of understanding with medicine. On her deathbed, Martha said to him, "Can you please not remarry?" Now, this was because she had some very bad relations with her two stepmothers. And Jefferson did honour that promise. But that did not extend to slaves. Now, I'm going to call it what it is in rape, because a slave cannot consent, especially an underage girl like Sally Hemings, who's actually Martha Randolph's half-sister, which makes it even more icky. It's believed that the relationship started in France. Eventually, Sally Hemings bore at least 6 children, which only the past decade DNA has confirmed was actually his, put the rumour to rest that it was a true thing. He did give Sally Hemings and her children preferential treatment and freedom, as you could see probably in many plantations across America. people did bring this up at the time as a thing to batter Jefferson, where you'd especially see it with the anti-slavery, such as Adams saying, you're sleeping with a slave, that's disgusting and gross. But back then it didn't really matter, because these women were seen as property, slaves were seen as property. As long as you didn't have a common law marriage or something, nobody particularly cared. But I think one thing, on his deathbed, after he died, they opened up a locket that Jefferson had, and it was a locket of his wife Martha's hair. So years and years after that she died, he still thought of her. So he did think highly enough of her to not have affairs with white women and remarry, but he probably didn't think Sally Hemings crossed as an affair. That was just sort of his business. And that is something that, I know we said we're not going to judge his presidency on his personality and what he did behind the scenes, but when you look at his moral character, pretty low on the rankings. Raping an underage slave will probably put you nearly dead bottom. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that affected his. Again, it didn't really affect his presidency too much.
Yeah,
he kept that part separate.
Yeah. And this is the part of it where knowing that something is wrong and doing it is really indefensible. It's very clear that Jefferson viewed slavery as an evil. When Congress, at the first opportunity they could, Congress made the international slave trade illegal. They did so. He said it was a moral evil. The citizens of Africa had done no wrong. They had committed no crime. There was no reason for them to be brought over. It was an act of evil. It basically was what he was saying. By all accounts, he knew it. He knew this was wrong. He knew what was going on was wrong and evil, and yet he chose to do it and to commit what we consider today to be a crime against someone who he probably saw as no more than property. It really does bode poorly. It's that matter of knowing that something is wrong and doing it. It's hard to reconcile how someone can think that way. I know I can't reconcile it.
Yeah, I completely understand.
So with that, we're going to be ranking the two presidents we discussed so we can wrap up the episode. First, we'll start with Adams. So we rank again, essentially A through F. So I guess we'll go the opposite direction of what we did last time. Sarah, do you have a rating first here?
If I was obviously rating Abigail Adams, it would be an A+, but considering she wasn't president, though she was commonly detracted as Mrs. Presidentess by the press because she was well known to influence her husband's decision. Big taboo back then. I'd probably give him maybe a B, solid B, because he wasn't the best president, and that's down to a number of bad decisions, maybe his personality, and the fact he was following Washington, hard act to follow. But I think he did later realise that the Alien Sedition Acts were a bad idea, but you can't really excuse that because he actually did them. I think he'll forever be remembered more as a diplomat. He'll never be remembered as a president, perhaps in a way that Ulysses S. Grant is often more remembered as a general than a president. So I would give him a solid B. He wasn't scandalous. Beyond the Alien Sedition, I don't think there was too much scandal that would push him towards the bottom, but I don't think he did anything great enough to rank him higher. He's sort of a president that there's maybe goodwill because he was a founding father. But if he didn't have that goodwill for founding father, he'd probably be lower. So I'd give him a B.
Mm-hmm.
I would also have to give it. Well, I would personally give him like a C+. I think he's just an average president, certainly a better founding father and diplomat. But I can't really excuse the last part of the Sedition Act. And ultimately, I just do think that his ego influenced his decision-making too much in the presidential office. And I don't think he was as suited and as steady of a leader in terms of being a chief executive as someone like Washington. Certainly much better working on the behalf of a leader like Washington in the diplomatic sphere rather than himself trying to assume that executive position. What about you, Eric?
Since we're doing whole letters, I think generally we're not doing pluses or minuses, although I don't think we're marking them as much. It's really, I would put him as a B. It would be as close to a B- as possible. Really, really borderline between being in the C+, or I do think you compare him to some of the other presidents, he's above average in a lot of respects. Alien and Sedition Act is really, really bad, but one piece of legislation can only do so much. The fact he ceded power after losing is a big mark for him that hadn't happened before in American history. And I do give him substantial credit for that, for doing it to a political rival who, while he did reconcile with, he certainly at the time was not on friendly terms with. So I would give him a B, but it would be about as close to a C as a B can get, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. And we'll move on to Jefferson now. And obviously, we would all rank him horribly low on the moral scale. But Sarah, do you have a rating in terms of his effectiveness?
I'd probably give him, I'm going to use the minus and plus. I'm going to say maybe an A minus B plus borderline, because I think, again, moral failings aside, he was a very good president. He is not just us saying it, but commonly remembered as historically well. Obviously, we can disagree with historical rankings, but I do think they have them dead on. He was hugely, hugely influential, and I don't think we can really overstate how important the Louisiana Purchase was. I think that alone, that's a great act that puts him above. John Adams didn't have a great thing that he did in the same way Jefferson or Washington did, and I think that's what drags Adams down. But Jefferson was able to get those great acts to push him above, and he's remembered not only just after his presidency, but even today, he is well regarded as president, which you can't say a lot about them. As we discussed, Andrew Jackson has slid down the ratings, was lauded at the time, and pretty much was until maybe like very recent history. But Jefferson has managed to keep that above, as Eric said, by not keeping politics and personal things together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And with that, we're going to wrap this episode up.
We haven't given ours for Jefferson.
Oh, I'm sorry. Someone said dinner was ready, so I kind of just lost all sense of time at that point. But I would give Jefferson an A. Just restate everything I said during the episode. Truly an influential president. I don't think there's any way you could argue against that. And, he, unlike some other presidents, managed to keep his moral shortcomings in his personal life from really influencing his decisions as president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would give him an A as well. It would be probably closer to an A minus on the scale. He'd probably be in my top 10 if I were to do it. I would have to take a look at, towards the end and see where he would lie after we go through all these presidents. But he would certainly be close to the top 10 in terms of his accomplishments. Again, you look at the moral failings, they're there, but they didn't affect his office. On the issue of slavery, in terms of what he did in office, certainly not bad to abolish the slave trade at the first opportunity. The specific Louisiana Purchase, the foreign policy is probably towards the end where things really started to fall apart. If he had another term, he would be lower on this list because he would have had to deal with kind of the simmering tensions that have been building up to that point. But you can't really pin that on him. You can't pin the War of 1812 on him, I don't think. Although he does bear a little bit of culpability. It's probably his weakest point as president, as opposed to Adams, where the foreign policy was the strong point. With Jefferson, the foreign policies, I think, certainly the weak point.
Mm-hmm. And now that we've given our final thoughts on Jefferson, we can wrap up this episode, and we'll be back with you again. Hold on. Yes, we'll be back with you again, hopefully next Monday. So thank you again for watching. Thank you to Eric and Sarah, and we'll see you again next time.